Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Oftentimes, there's argument about the cause for the problems in our criminal justice system, and there are many different takes. In 2020, Jason Brennan and his co-author Chris Surprenant published a book expressing their truly original point of view called Injustice for All: How Financial Incentives Corrupted and Can Fix the U.S. Criminal Justice System. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jason Brennan, the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Jason is incredibly productive and prolific. I almost didn't know what to interview him on, considering he writes a fascinating book almost every year. But given the current moment, this one seemed extremely fitting. Welcome, Jason.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into it, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
God, that you asked me that question and I'm like, I don't know what the most important thing is that I should know that I don't. So can I give you two quick things maybe?
Yes, that would be great.
A strategic thing for living your life, and this is completely generic advice that's not original to me, but I've noticed hardly anyone takes it, is don't let the urgent get in the way of the important, right? Every single day, something's going to be coming up that's going to be demanding your attention. And the key to having a happy, successful life and whatever you're trying to do is making sure that you block out the time you need when your brain or your body is at its best to dedicate it to the things that really matter, and then let the urgent stuff take up the rest of the time. So I feel like that's a big key to getting stuff done and being happy. In terms of ethics, because I'm an ethics professor, I think the most important thing for people to learn, especially maybe at your age, is that the problems of the world are for the most part not solved by people being bad, or not caused by people being bad, and won't be solved by people being better. Now, I don't mean to say it is true that if I waved my magic wand and turned everyone into an angel, that almost all these problems would disappear. That's true. I think that's correct. But when you see bad behavior out there in the world, it's usually not going to be as simple as well, if only I were in that position, because I'm a nice person, good things will happen. In reality, most of us would probably act badly as well. And a lot of these problems are beyond that. So I feel we often tend to think that the issue is a lack of good intentions. And young people in particular always seem to think, well, old people, middle-aged people, they just are kind of selfish and don't have good intentions. And we young people do. When we take over, finally, good things will happen because our good intentions will make sure things happen. And that story, young people have been telling themselves that story forever, and it's not true.
Let's get into it. The American criminal justice system is a mess, to say the least. Cops are too violent, they make mistakes, and often they don't face any consequences. Yet, when people commit crimes, their punishments are too harsh, and we imprison more people than any other country in the world. Well, at least that we know of. While a growing number of people recognize that things need to change and that there are problems, short of screaming and denouncing racism, there are few people who actually offer real solutions. And in part, I think it's because the system is so complex and there are so many issues. Can you tell us about the three basic hypotheses that prevail when looking at the criminal justice system and how these approaches are only partially correct?
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I tend to think, my somewhat a friend, sometimes colleague, Arnold Kling, says that we all kind of tend to look at the world through an ideological lens, at least all those of us who have ideologies too. And we engage in a kind of normative sociology where we see a problem and we want the cause of the problem to be the type of thing that we don't like because of our ideology. And that often prevents us from seeing what's really going on. So I think libertarians, when they look at what's wrong with the United States criminal justice system, their thought is, it has to be the drug war. After all, when did things start really getting bad? It was kind of around the 70s, and that's when the drug war really got going. We know that criminalizing drugs increases violent crime and increases gang activity and that kind of thing. We know that there's ever harsher penalties, and a lot of the things we complain about in the book about, say, civil asset forfeiture and the militarization of police really do have a lot of their roots in the drug war. So they're not completely wrong. That is part of it, but it's just not the whole story. John Paff in his book Locked In says that if you released all people who were in jail only for like drug related crimes, you'd still have about 85 to 90% of people left. And even if you optimistically think that some of the violent crimes are the result of like having to do with the criminalization of drugs, maybe this person was in a gang because they were selling drugs or something like that, and they did something violent while selling them, that's still not going to really cut it down. So there's more going on here. And part of it is like the US just is an unusually crime-ridden place compared to other OECD countries. The kinds of countries we like to compare ourselves to, we have a lot of crime, right? And it's puzzling why. And to be honest, we could talk about this at length. I mean, I've read so much on this. So I feel like given I've written a book and published stuff on this, I should be an expert, but I don't even really know why crime went up, and I don't really know why crime went down. And I don't really think anyone does know. It's like every hypothesis we have kind of sucks, and there's pretty good evidence against that hypothesis. So it's a genuine puzzle. But I guess I would say that like one way to think about the US is rather than thinking of it as sort of like a low functioning European country, think of it as like a high functioning post-colonial country. And that kind of makes more sense of it. Anyways, progressives, they tend to want to blame things on inequality and poverty. But that sort of doesn't really work out either because crime went up after the 50s and 60s, and then it started going down in the 1990s. It's kind of going up recently again, though we don't know if that trend will hold. It might just be a result of COVID and a few other things. It wasn't as though people were getting poorer. That wasn't it. People were getting richer. The people, like even in communities that had a lot of crime, generally speaking, people were richer, like say in the 90s than they were in the 60s, and they were richer in the 2010s than they were in the 90s. So like the causal arrow doesn't go the right way. Similarly, it is true that there's systematic racism inside of the criminal justice system. You can put meaning on that, and you can find things that would count as evidence for it. I'm not going to deny that. I think it is a problem, but I don't think it's the problem in the sense that if I waved my magic wand and made everyone not racist anymore, that would get rid of it. Because in part because think of it like, in 1950s America, you could like walk around on the street and openly say racist things, and people would not just tolerate it, but like clap and be like, yeah, you're absolutely right. And now if you say that kind of stuff, if you say stuff that isn't even racist, but someone might call racist, you could get your life ruined for that. So attitudes towards racism have changed dramatically. People are significantly less racist now than they are in the past. There are people that deny that. I don't think they're taking the evidence seriously. But nevertheless, the problems got worse, and they've continued to get worse. And in fact, and so that brings us maybe to like the final position, which is what conservatives might say. And conservatives might say, look, the U.S. has more people in jail because it has more crime. There are family breakdowns. There's high crime areas. There are places where you have generation of people engaged in crime. We just have more crime than other places. So of course, if you have the same standards about enforcement as, say, a European country, but you apply those standards to the US, what you're going to get is a higher rate of imprisonment. That's partly true. We do, in fact, have more crime. But some of the problems with this is that the length of incarceration, the length of sentences, the harshness of the system, the degree to which the police are violent has continued to go up, even though crime kind of went down in the 90s. And you might think, oh, it's going down because the crime started going down because police enforcement went up, which is partly true. It's not entirely true, but it's partly part of the story. But again, you have a thing where the causal, like the arrows on your graph aren't going the right way. Like the curves aren't moving together. So crime goes up and then goes down, and the level of enforcement just goes up the whole time. So we'd expect these two things to kind of, one curve would go up and one would go down if it were the entire story. So again, I think it's like liberals, libertarians, and progressives, they all have a story they want to tell, but they're kind of like, that proverbial thing of three blind men feeling an elephant. They are feeling something, but they're only feeling part of the story. They don't have the whole story.
You write, quote, "When it comes to the color of justice in America, follow the money. What matters even more than black and white is green. Financial incentives and people responding rationally to those incentives are responsible for most, if not all, of the dramatic changes we've observed in the United States criminal justice for over the last 50 years. End quote. How did you come to that conclusion, and why don't more people see money as a driver for our system's dysfunction?
Yeah, partly because the story we end up telling isn't really all that sexy. I mean, people do like stories about money being a problem, but the version that they like is something like George Soros or Charles Koch uses their money to buy the election and then pays politicians to do something evil. So it's like there's an identifiable person with deep pockets who has evil and darkness in their hearts, and they cause it with their money. People like that kind of story. But the story we're telling is one about systematic behavior that's resulting from incentives. So like the way that an economist typically is going to think about a problem, when you see systematic behavior, the first thing you do is ask, why would everyone act this way? You can't just be a couple bad apples in the barrel because it's like everybody's doing it. Even people who are well-intentioned, when they start participating, like start acting the same way. There's got to be something else going on. And so the thing to look at is, what are the rules of the game by which the different actors who are participating in the system are bound? Like, how is money allocated? How do people get raises? Where do jobs come from? How do people get elected into office or lose their jobs and so on? And when you start looking at all that, you see there are all these perverse incentives affecting like basically everyone involved in the criminal justice system. These incentives are often cashed out in financial terms or something similar to financial terms. And that stuff also turns out to be unusual typically to the US. And that partially explains like why the US is weird. Because again, like whenever you give an explanation, if you're trying to explain why the US is so weird, you need to give a story that makes sense about that's different for us as compared to other countries. And so that even includes things like in the US, this is a minor point. I don't want to say this is the whole problem or even much of the problem, but in the US, there's a lot of electing of officials who are involved in criminal justice, because like we'll elect the district attorney. You might even elect people under the district attorney. You might elect judges and so on. And in other countries, you typically don't have anything like the election of people involved in criminal justice. The system is handled and is kind of insulated from voters. And that turns out to have a whole wide range of perverse incentives that partly explain what's going on.
So let's look at police violence. A lot of kids my age and older, just people all over the place in America, think that one of the biggest issues is police violence. Your book looks at the data and shows that the U.S. is an outlier here, especially in modern times. Can you describe that trend?
Yeah, and by the way, I should say it's hard to really verify that because, we don't have excellent data about police violence the way that we have about a lot of other things. So, we can say things like, it really is the case that the average person in the Netherlands is like 6 inches taller now than they were like 75 years ago, because we have all of this data proving it. But police and others are not really calculating and writing down every incident of violence and all of that. We don't have like really reliable data. I actually work in the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, the Virginia delegation, and we had all these hearings and meetings about hate crimes in Virginia and elsewhere. And I was kind of disturbed to find out that we don't even have something like a reliable and consistent hate crime reporting system like in Virginia or the U.S. as a whole. We have a bunch of different databases that use completely different methods about not only what counts as a hate crime, but like how it gets reported. And that's for something where it's kind of easier to report and there's at least an incentive to do it, as opposed to like with cops. Are they going to write down that they kicked the crap out of somebody? They're probably not going to do that. So our data is pretty poor, but insofar as we have it, it does look like, American police are more violent than, say, European police. Part of that might be, I think it's worth saying that, if you're in Germany and you're pulling somebody over, it's not all that likely that the person has a pistol in their glove box. And so the police are in a way rationally more afraid of people in the US than they would be in Europe because we are more armed. There's a higher chance that the person will have a weapon and that they might fight back. So that is part of it, but I don't want to say that's the entire story, in part because insofar as we have data about police violence on a state-by-state or locale-by-locale basis, you don't find something like the police are more violent in the places where people are better armed. That's not really it. Mm-hmm. You don't even really quite find the police are more violent in the places where there's more crime. That doesn't really seem to be it either. It seems to be almost somewhat arbitrary, like why they're violent in some places and not in others. So, the police are more violent, and part of it I think has to do with training, and then we can talk about why the training is like this. But pretty much, and this is a case where like the libertarian story starts to look pretty good for a variety of reasons in the U.S. Starting really around like the 70s and especially into the 80s with the drug war. there was a lot of sort of militarization of the police. Police were given military weapons. They were given military training. The way the police were taught to handle civilian encounters changed, where they became less like a person trying to diffuse a situation and more like I'm supposed to make sure that I, the police officer, am always protected. My safety comes before everybody else's. I should feel free to shoot if I feel that I might be threatened, and so on. And so they were sort of trained to be more violent and to be more self-serving. And then, of course, with the issues with regard to their ability to be prosecuted or to face civil charges with regard to this, means that they don't have much incentive to act differently. Now, by the way, when I said that they become militarized, I actually feel like I'm being unfair to people in the military because, I've had a lot of friends. I have, band members who, were in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that. And they can tell you that the rules of engagement that they had as far as like when they were allowed to draw a gun or draw a weapon and fire at somebody were really quite strict and are actually significantly stricter than what the rules of engagement are for American police officers dealing with American citizens on American soil.
Wow. Wow. And we'll get into that. But right now, I kind of want to ask a question that I had on my mind earlier, but then I got distracted. And I think it kind of fits in here. The story we often hear about and the stuff we see in the news is often about police brutality. And it's in the context of race. And that is an aspect of it. But the book is called Injustice for All. And all means everyone. So why is that? What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say I'm definitely not saying like we're all in this together equally in terms of like our propensity to be victimized by the police, our propensity to be mistreated by the criminal justice system. It really is different. For instance, like, here's evidence of systematic racism. Insofar as we have data about drug use, white people probably do drugs more than black people, and they probably do harder drugs more than black people. It used to be people, when you said that, would like, that can't possibly be true. But now because of the opioid epidemic in particular, I think everyone does know that's true. But even before that took off, we had good evidence that was the case. Nevertheless, black people are much more likely to be prosecuted for drug crimes and for drug possession than white people are. So it's like, who's doing the drugs? Well, white people more than blacks. Who gets prosecuted? Blacks significantly more than whites. And again, it's not severity like, well, lots of white people were smoking marijuana and black people were doing hard drugs. Nope, that wasn't it. It was like white people were doing the hard drugs even more too. So it is the case that with that, or say with police brutality, I'm much more likely to be treated politely by a police officer than a black person would be who was otherwise identical to me, that kind of thing, right? So it is not like we're all in it equally, but we are all victims of injustice or subject to possible injustice. It's not really a fair system for anybody. And some reasons to think that when we talk about the racist story in particular is that, states like Wyoming that are majority white and have very few minorities have such high rate of incarceration and prosecution of their white citizens that they are harsher towards their white citizens than minorities are treated in like European countries. Like the incarceration rate is incredibly high, right? And that's like the places that have relatively low incarceration rates. So like incarceration rates and things like that towards white people have gone up dramatically over the past 50 years as well. So if it were just racism, you might expect to see something like black people are highly prosecuted and highly incarcerated and white people aren't. What you actually find is that white people are frequently victimized and prosecuted and incarcerated by the system, and then black people are incarcerated at an even higher rate. But both of which are, in a sense, disproportionate to the amount of crime that we have and make the U.S. an outlier compared to other countries. Further, we say, like in the introduction, we were trying to motivate people to care about this topic, and we're giving them all sorts of reasons why we think they should be concerned. Things like, well, justice matters. That's reason. Like it matters that we're a good or bad country. It matters that we do the right thing. Things like, hey, you got to pay for this stuff, right? Things like, if we do this the wrong way, a lot of what we end up doing with incarceration is create generation after generation of criminals for dynamics we could get into possibly later. And so if you want to reduce crime, you should care about what's the actual best mechanism for doing it. But another reason to care is that we are all criminals. And I don't just mean we're criminals in the sense that when I was 20, I totally felt free to drink alcohol whenever I felt like it, and I would try to hide it from the police because I don't think that's a good law. I don't just mean that. I don't just mean that like I speed when I drive. Not a lot, but I do. I don't mean simple things like that. What I mean is that like there's good reason to think that, and we cite a couple different studies on this. One there's a famous book called 3 Felonies a Day, which is sort of, it's really an exaggeration that like, it's like, oh, the average American commits 3 felonies a day. It's probably not true. But what it probably is true is that overwhelmingly, almost every single adult American who considers themselves to be a law-abiding citizen has done something in the past year which turns out to be something that could be prosecuted as a felony and could give them a year's worth of prison time. And it's partly because there's so many regulations and rules, and there's so much discretion that police and prosecutors have about who they prosecute. No, I'm not saying you should be paranoid. Like, I think it's extremely unlikely I will ever be charged with anything other than like, maybe speeding, right? Like that's pretty much it. But nevertheless, a lot of us are unknowingly breaking rules, and the rules are designed that way on purpose. They're designed to give discretion to prosecutors. For example, one of my colleagues will often teach something about white collar crime because we work in a business school, and he wants people to understand how the law works in order to help keep them out of jail. And he's really clear in telling them, look, basically, given the rules that the SEC and a few other regulatory agencies have, pretty much every single company is always in violation of a bunch of rules. Not because the companies are evil, but because the rules are designed in order to be violated, so that at any time, if there's political expedience in doing so, or if they want some money or whatever it might be, they can go after a particular company and attack them. Like, it's by design. Well, that's happening with lots of other things that affect like little people like us, not just the big corporations.
That's terrifying, but also not that surprising. And I really don't like that. Let's talk about incentives. So, you mentioned the militarization of police, and that's because the federal government distributes billions of dollars in military equipment to police departments around the country. And we can talk about the training too. The result is that local cops are wandering around in heavy and dangerous military gear. And many times a day, they're going not necessarily to stop school shootings, but to deliver on drug warrants. So can you tell us how we got there and what incentives are at play and what outcomes that produces?
Yeah. Hopefully listeners will forgive me if I don't off the top of my head remember the exact numbers anymore. I can give you roughly what they are. Mm-hmm. But it's the kind of thing where, say around the year like 1973 or 1975, there was something like 500 SWAT team deployments in the entire United States. There was a lot of crime back then and a lot of violence, by the way. So there were reasons to deploy them. But these SWAT teams are being deployed for the kinds of things you think SWAT teams are for, right? Active shooters, violence, etc., that kind of thing. Now, the number works out to be something like 93% or 94% of SWAT team, maybe it's 91, but it's around that. Like, something like 90% of SWAT team deployments are knocking on somebody's door who they have no reason to think is armed and no reason to think is going to fight back to serve them a drug warrant. And so part of this is not only are you getting this equipment, but oftentimes there's additional funding that comes from being on the SWAT unit. You, as a police officer, get paid more if you get this training. Sometimes the local jurisdiction will get money from the state or the federal government to engage in the training. They'll get money for using it. Sometimes it's just the old-fashioned thing where, I think anyone from New England might know these sorts of stories because we all know how funding works in those towns. Like if the roads, what's the name for? I can't remember. I'm suddenly blanking. But the people who are in charge of like plowing the roads, if they're given a budget of $80,000 for road plowing in 1 year and they only spend $60,000, it's pretty common that like your budget gets reduced the next year. And so what a lot of offices will try to do is make sure that you spend all of your money so that you can then justify getting a bigger budget. Well, that's true police officers too, frequently. And so they often have an incentive to do things that are more expensive, which means use more people, send more people, use more weapons, that kind of stuff. So all these things are at play with police officers. And that's part of the perverse incentives and perverse financial incentives. But there's also more hidden financial incentives that matter too. Like, frankly, like let's say you and I decide like after this, we're like, that was a pretty good talk. Why don't we meet up? And then like when we meet up, you pull out a knife and stab me a bunch of times and rob me. Right. Oh. If I survive this, I would be able to sue you, and I don't know how much money you have, but I'd be able to get something from you, right? Because you violently attacked me. And also you'd probably go to jail. Right. So you'd have like a civil case against you and a criminal case against you. The fact that you would have a civil and criminal case against you has to, on some margin, make it less likely that you'll do it. I don't want to say that like people are complete selfish sociopaths and that they would all be stabbing each other, but for the threat of retribution in civil cases and so on. But it does matter. right? It makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, police officers are, for the most, I don't want to say entirely, but they're largely immune to these things. Maybe the tide is turning over the past couple of years, but overwhelmingly, prosecutors are loath to try to prosecute police officers for excessive violence. Juries were, for the most part, loath. One of the reasons prosecutors were loath to do is because juries would refuse to actually convict them. We often have laws in place which protect police from having any kind of lawsuit against them, right? And that doesn't discipline their behavior. And further, part of the problem you have with lawsuits, if you're not suing an individual person, is that, a corporation, including government as a corporation, it doesn't have a body to kick. It doesn't have a soul to damn. When you sue the government and you take its money, it doesn't mean that the person who did something wrong suffers. What it usually means is that the government then just taxes people more and other people pay for it. That's not a super strong incentive to behave better. So even when people do successfully sue police departments and they might get, say, a $10 million settlement from the city, is like the city pays for it. It's not always it's usually not the case that the police officers see any difference in their pay or their salary or anything like that. So for that reason, Chris and I in our book say, here's an idea. What if whenever, I'm not saying this is just, I'm just saying it would change incentives. What if whenever a police officer is sued for being overly violent and for using excessive force, that the money, or at least some of that money that goes to pay the victim, has to come out of the police pension fund? Just imagine that were the case. Now, again, maybe it's not a good idea to do it, but just imagine that it's in place. You would change incentives pretty dramatically, because now police officers would start policing each other, because they know that, if you and I are partners and you know who I am, I beat up everybody. When you let me beat up everybody, that means that you'll have less money when you retire. So you might actually stop and intervene and try to prevent me from doing it. But right now it's no, if I beat people up, if they sue the town, it doesn't really affect you. So you don't have much incentive to police me and make sure that I'm behaving properly as a police officer.
It's just my hypothesis. I don't know how well this actually plays out in the real world, but it seems to me that the presence of police officers decked out in high-tech military gear and all that would aggravate people and possibly cause more crime or cause people to be more on alert. And so there's more violence or something.
Yeah, I think that's probably not true. And I'm not saying that as someone who really likes having cops around. I have to admit, because of this research, I've become, and also because of what we see on TV, I've become fairly apprehensive around police officers, even though I know intellectually speaking, it's unlikely that I will be harassed by them. But I just recognize, shoot, this person could just shoot me and they probably get away with it. I don't want to exaggerate that, but there's a lot to be said to that effect. So, but in fact, a lot of the research says that the presence of police officers in general actually is a pretty strong deterrent towards crime. It reduces crime in the area and makes people feel overall more secure. There are racial disparities there where white people tend to be comfortable around cops and black people tend to be uncomfortable. But despite that, there is in fact a lot, and this is actually one of the problems with the whole defund the police movement. In fact, many times black civil rights leaders, black community leaders, and so on were in favor of increasing police presence because they recognize that having police presence reduces crime, and they might be living in neighborhoods or areas that have lots of crime. Foreman has a really good book about this called Locking Up Our Own that talks about why that was their view, and often still is. So, I don't think simply eliminating police is really going to help much. It's more like we want there to be police, but we want them to be better behaved. And I know you mentioned in particular, not just there being police, but being police in military type gear. And so maybe you're right that having a full SWAT uniform or something, or carrying an assault rifle as opposed to just a pistol might change things. But I don't know of there being data that supports that. I just know that in general, police presence means reduced crime.
Makes sense. So let's shift gears and talk about some of the incentives that explain our country's proclivity for harsh punishment. First, you note that the way that voters elect DAs, prosecutors, and criminal court judges, that creates incentives for bad policing. How does that work?
Yeah, we start with voters, in fact, because everyone likes to point fingers at everyone else, but they don't like to point it at themselves. But in fact, part of the reason why the U.S. has kind of a lousy criminal justice system is because it's surprisingly democratic. And you might think, maybe overall it's good to have a democratic form of government, but it doesn't follow that every single thing should be subject to democratic oversight, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's, and yeah, maybe you personally are more inclined to agree with that. I find people often resist that. So the issue is that voters are rationally ignorant and rationally irrational, which causes them often to support counterproductive policies. You can see that with like a good example would be like Minneapolis had a lot of problems with their policing. Their policing needed real reform. I am totally in favor of reforming their police system. But then voters kind of overreacted, or not overreact, but misreact to it by like actually trying to reduce police presence and all this other stuff. And then lo and behold, they get a lot of crime. And the very people that they're trying to help end up being the victims of this crime and so on, because they're not really paying attention to the facts and the evidence. The reason voters act this way is because democracy creates a collective action problem. So to illustrate, just imagine that you're in a class with like 1,000 other students. And suppose the professor comes in on day one and says, like, all right, 14 weeks from now, I'm going to have all of you take a final exam. This final exam will be the only thing that counts towards a grade in this class, nothing else. So this is 100% of your grade. But I'm an egalitarian, so what I'm going to do is average everybody's scores together, and you're all going to walk out of here with exactly the same grade. You'd expect, and in fact, empirically, what we find when you run experiments on this is that the average grade would be an F. It's not because people are stupid. It's not because they're bad or incompetent. It's because the perverse incentives make it so that for any given individual, if they decide to study, they incur all the cost of studying, but they get basically no benefits. I mean, just to illustrate, I think this math works out right. Like imagine that the average grade in the class with the other 999 students is a 30, but then I get 100 on the test. So I think that takes the average up from like a 30 to about a 30.7, right? So like, it's like, why bother study, right? So if I were stuck in that class, unless I could overcome this collective action problem, I probably wouldn't learn the material either, right? That's effectively what's going on with democracy. We don't really learn the material. And worse, because we don't learn the material, we're also sort of free to indulge a lot of our biases. So like when I'm crossing the street, if I see a Mack truck barreling towards me at like 90 miles an hour, I don't dare indulge the fantasy that really that's Optimus Prime and he's going to like pick me up and we're going to go on an adventure to fight Megatron. Because if I'm wrong about that, the world will punish me for it. Like I will bear the consequences. So that's the kind of thing where even though human beings might be somewhat lazy and inclined to be biased about certain things, when we face bad consequences from thinking irrationally, and we get benefits from thinking rationally, we tend to be disciplined to be better and better at that over time. When it comes to democratic voting, though, we're not, because how I vote doesn't really matter. Like if I stay home or if I vote one way or the other way, it really doesn't make any difference. The chances that it would affect the outcome are extremely small. It depends on where you're voting and what you're voting for and all that, but they're really vanishingly small. So we're basically all kind of like the students in that class, and we're free to sort of indulge our biases, which makes us like easily misled by demagoguery, or we do a lot of what we do in politics is just kind of social signaling. Like I was writing about this today for a book I'm working on now. It's like I'm from New England, so because I'm from New England, I root for the Patriots and the Red Sox and things like that. And the reason I pick those teams is because that's what makes me fit in with the other people where I grew up with. And when I publicly root for them, when I'm biased in favor of them and against the Yankees and so on, then people reward me socially. They're more likely to be my friend. They're more likely to hang out with me. They're more likely to do business with me or whatever. So we're kind of doing that with regard to politics. And the reason we do it is because our votes don't really matter. So think about how this works with crime. So like there's a lot of stories about this. And the most famous one, which is an anecdote, but it's illustrative and there's really a lot to this and the data shows it. Back in like the 80s, so like in Massachusetts, where I was born, I spent a good part of my life there too. I lived in Massachusetts, I think a total of like 14 years. A Republican governor came up with a furlough program, or he was one that signed it into law, where they were letting criminals who had good behavior out on weekends to like reconnect with the community, to have jobs and things like that. This was overall a really good idea. The data shows it worked. One of the reasons it works is because the opposite increases criminality. I mean, what do we do with criminals? We put them in a cage and lock them up with other criminals in a violent and scary environment where the only way they can survive is by kind of becoming more criminal themselves. This reinforces criminality. So the furlough, and then we also like deprive them of like any kind of relationship with their community and so on, which cuts them off and makes it harder for them to reintegrate. So people knew this, and so they tried this furlough program. And overall, the data shows it was very effective, and it significantly reduced recidivism. It made criminals who were convicted behave better. It made them get out sooner, et cetera, et cetera. Great program. But of course, Willie Horton famously escapes, in the 80s. And during Dukakis's reign, when he was governor of Massachusetts, and he goes down to, I think, Maryland, he attacks someone, he rapes a woman, he does horrible things. And then George Bush, the first, when he's running for president against Dukakis, complains, well, Dukakis just gives like weekend passes to criminals and they rape people. This scares the hell out of everybody. Everyone goes against Dukakis, and every politician learned their lesson then. You have to be tough on crime. And so what you found for most of, kind of really like for like the past, maybe it's changing recently, but for like a good 20 to 30 year period is that both Democrats and Republicans who are operating on a local level compete with each other to be seen as especially tough on crime, right? And it's because they know that voters will reward that. Even though when voters are doing it, what the voters don't realize is that it's not really working.
So what about our prison system? You explain in the book that prisons are usually located in rural towns where they serve as a source of employment for poor and often white communities. What incentives and problems exist there?
Yeah, a good analogy would be, think about the TSA, right? Mm-hmm. I think, there are some people who defend the TSA. I even at one point in my life had friends with someone who was a TSA agent, which, makes me feel a little bit dirty, but there you go. If you look at the TSA and you go, shit, every single time they try to test the TSA to see how good they are at catching weapons, they suck. 95% of weapons get through, right? They always fail audits. They're terrible. You're like, what the hell? If you think of them as a security agency, you've got to be like, they absolutely suck. But if you think of it as a workfare policy, the purpose of the TSA is partly to give welfare to people who otherwise might not be employable, and hire them and give them like a job, because, Americans are not really big on just giving basic income through government. So a lot of it, what it's for is for that. It's not all of it, but that is part of it. Then it starts to make sense. You're like, oh, security is not really the point of the TSA. It's something else. Right. So Similarly, building a prison, that's a big contract. You're going to hire like the local guys with the bulldozers and local building companies to come in and build it. You'll then create jobs for poor people who otherwise might not get a job, because it's not like the typical prison guard is somebody who just got his MBA from Harvard Business School and is trying to decide between working for Deloitte, Goldman Sachs, or being a prison guard, right? In fact, they're frankly, and I'm probably going to get an angry email from someone who's like a brilliant and wonderful prison guard, and I'm sorry, I'm just talking about things in general, right? And before you send me the angry email, keep in mind, I wrote an entire book about how much college professors are assholes, so I don't need to hear it. Like, if I'm attacking you, I attack everybody. Don't worry about it. Me, myself. So don't worry about it. I've already done it, and better than you have. So there we go. Caveat aside, the typical people who are doing prison guards work are not people who had like a lot of really excellent other job opportunities. They're not like carpenters. They're not like plumbers. They're often not people who just have like a great work history. So part of what it is a workfare thing. It's bringing money from the state back home to the community. One of the reasons why local communities often support prisons too has to do with thinking about the trade-off between what they have to pay for and what they don't. So what's more effective overall is to have local policing that prevents crime. But if a municipality pays for that policing, they pay for it. The taxpayers pay for it. It comes out of people's pockets. People don't really want to pay for things, right? They'd rather externalize the cost of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. So another thing you can do is lobby to have ever harsher sentences, and you can basically try to substitute post hoc imprisonment for pre-hoc policing. And when you do the imprisonment as a substitute, other people pay for it because it gets paid for by the entire state. You only pay a portion of that. So communities often have an incentive to use the prison system instead of trying to like use police to stop crime from happening in the first place. And finally, there's even another perverse incentive that exists is even how census things are counted. So we found in cases where you have, like in Connecticut, for instance, areas that like you're getting additional state senators or additional representatives because you have a bunch of, say, people taken from the city who are put into the community, like a rural community, and they count for the purpose of like getting representation on the state state government, or even sometimes on the national government. The prisoners count as residents of where they are imprisoned rather than where they're from. So it's like, oh, we get like 4,000 prisoners here, and then we get more power in government, even though these prisoners are not free, they're not voting, they're not participating, right? And that's a perverse incentive too.
How does over-criminalization fit into all of this?
Yeah, so over-incarceration would be something like putting too many people in jail and or putting them in jail for too long. Over-criminalization is making too many things crimes. And we have a whole chapter that's really much more philosophical than it is empirical, just trying to ask people, what do you really think should be a crime? And libertarians are often like to use little thought experiments to sort of motivate this. And they go, look, when you make something a crime, at the end of the day, you are threatening somebody with deadly violence. Why? Because you're saying you need to do this or not do this. And if you don't, we're going to say penalize you financially. But if you don't pay that penalty, we're going to give you a bigger financial penalty. If you don't pay that, at some point of your non-compliance, somebody is going to show up with a weapon and try to force you to comply. And if you don't do it then, we're going to shoot you, right? Like that's what you're basically threatening. So I try to explain to people, look, not everything should be criminalized. I'm not sure what exactly should, but there has to be something like, it has to be something like a rights violation to others. There has to be something like there aren't more or better or more effective means of preventing the bad behavior. It can't simply be because it's immoral. Lots of things are immoral that should not be criminalized, right? Like it would be immoral for me to like call my mom up right now and say, hey mom, you never get to see your kids again, at least while they're minors, because not your kids, I'm sorry. You never get to see your grandchildren again while they're minors, just for the hell of it, just because I'm an asshole. I'm not going to let you do it. I shouldn't do that, but I could, and I shouldn't be penalized criminally for doing it. So we're like, look, part of what you just need to do is strip down the amount of crime and really get police officers working on the more serious stuff. And by the way, on behalf of police officers, I'd say, and I think a lot of police officers, if you interview them, will tell you this, part of what's going on is that police officers are often being used to deal with situations that they have no training in, right? It's not just that they're not trained badly, but they're not trained for certain things. Like if somebody's mentally ill and they're having an episode, right? Are you going to bring in a cop to deal with that person? I mean, that's not their level of expertise. They're not trained in how to talk somebody down who's sick or mentally ill. They're trained for apprehending violent criminals and for enforcing other rules, right? Like don't put them in that situation. That's not what they're good at. Yeah, so over-criminalization just means too many things are crimes. So we should reduce as much of that as we can and just focus on the stuff that really matters.
So you mentioned before that defunding the police doesn't really work. So why doesn't it work? How does it influence the incentives? Does it change them at all? Does it leave them intact?
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is something called the Washington Monument effect. So for listeners who haven't heard of that, the idea is like periodically Congress will say, the National Park Service, maybe we'll cut their funding a little bit. And the National Park Service, in order to protect its funding, will shut down not the no-name national parks that nobody ever goes to. Like I remember I did a tour across the country and went back and forth, and we went to some national park right outside of Montana, and they were like, oh, this is like the second least visited park in the U.S. Hardly everyone ever comes here. So if they're losing their budget, they should shut that down. Like that's the obvious thing. But they don't. They put barricades around the national, like the Washington Monument and other really popular things. And then like citizens get pissed. They contact their senator and say, give them more money, and it works. So part of what happens is police are doing that too. There is a little bit of like sour grapes behavior. Like if you're going to cut our budget, if you're going to assault us, we're just going to like do less enforcing. We're not going to do our jobs. And then people get upset and then they get their money back. Right? So part of the way it doesn't work is because police officers and police departments often react in a really crappy way. If they genuinely cared about the public, what they would do when they get a redacted budget is, a reduced budget, is ensure that they use their limited resources in the most important and effective way. But like everybody else, they're mostly self-interested and they don't do that. Again, I'm not saying police officers are special here. I think that's true of like pretty much everybody in every field, right? Including college professors. So that's part of it. But part of it also has to do with often the institutional rules that are put into place. Like, oh, the police officers are beating people up and mistreating them, so we'll just have the police officers stay home. No, it's not. That's not really going to work because then crime will increase and people will be victimized not by police officers but by others, right? So like what we need is better policing, not non-policing.
right? And I hate to say that because in my heart of hearts, I'm an anarchist. My view really is that like if people were not even angels, if everyone were just morally decent, we would not have police, we would not have criminal courts, we would not have government. We would all be anarchists if only we were just decent. The fact that we have government at all is because we're generally speaking really quite bad people. But so I have to put that as a caveat, though it might sound weird because people might think, oh, this guy's surprisingly pro-police. But really, my intellectual bias is to go the other way. But when I look at the data and I look at the research, it says having a good police presence is important for reducing crime. And people who are being victimized by police often need the police. So what we need are better police, not non-police.
I want to end with this question, though. What is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Yeah, you told me you'd ask me that. I was like racking my brain for thinking like, what's like the most significant or important thing? And there's all these different philosophical issues that I've changed my mind about. But I'll just tell you one, even if it's maybe not the most important one. I think I've always been pretty pro-immigration, but when I was, say, much younger, I accepted the view that like, well, if you had a lot more immigrants, that's going to depress everybody's wages, which seems to make sense when you first think about it, because you're just like, look, if there's a demand for labor and you flood the market with more labor, if you flood the market with more labor, then the supply of labor curve is going to change. It's going to shift. That's going to be a supply shock. And of course, the price is going to be lower in the same way that like, if you triple the number of PlayStation 5s in the country, the price of PlayStations will go down, right? Of course, that has to happen, right? Yeah. And the mistake I was making was I was assuming that labor was homogenous. And so every bit of new labor is just a substitute for existing labor. And then it turns out, as a matter of empirics, that for the most part, immigrants, when they come in, are what you might call, in economic terms, a complementary good rather than a substitute good, meaning they do different kinds of work, which doesn't substitute for what the work we already have here, and in fact enhances it and makes that other work more productive. A simple case, which is not really the best illustration, but just a personal illustration, is because I can pay other people to mow my lawn, I don't have to mow my lawn, and it's relatively cheap to do so. And that means that I can like give talks at universities and make more money doing that, right? So that kind of thing is actually happening all over. So it turned out I was wrong about that, and that in fact immigrants are, when immigrants from poorer countries go to richer countries, overwhelmingly they don't drop down, or they don't demote or reduce the wages of domestic workers. They actually increase them. Right. So when I was 20, I thought otherwise. When I started researching it, I found out that that was something I was wrong
about. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.